Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, you are the Ancient of Days, yet the ever-new God. Thank you for your mercy and faithfulness. As the dew refreshes the earth, so you restore us each day to newness of life. Sustain our lawmakers in their work. Give them guidance and inspiration to focus on issues that truly matter. Provide them the wisdom to meet needs, solve problems, and lift burdens. May the talents possessed by the members of this legislative body help in the awesome task of making our nation and world better. Lord, to those who are given the responsibility of seeking the ways of peace, empower them with creative stamina equal to this difficult task. We pray in your amazing name. Amen.
Will you please join me in the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands for, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You're very kind, lady. God bless you. Under the previous order, the leadership's time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will read.
Nomination, Department of Labor, Lori Chavez-DeRemer of Oregon to be Secretary.
Senator from Iowa.
For my colleagues who are protectionists, I think that when it comes to the issue of trade, we need less of Peter Navarro and more of Adam Smith. I think the certainty that comes with trade policy will benefit our economy the most. Hopefully, we don't have a government shutdown this week. I want my colleagues to remember that it costs money to shut down the government, costs money to open the government up. There's even some money being wasted this week as bureaucrats plan for a possible shutdown. And the government is supposed to be service for the American people, and you can't serve the American people if government is not functioning. I would also like to address my colleagues to remind them of the genocide of the 1990s in the Western Balkan region of the world, and of the Dayton Peace Accords of 1995 that brought an end to that genocide. For years, the leaders of the Serb entity within the country of Bosnia, Mr. Dodik, I think it's pronounced, has been threatening to have the Serb part secede. Remember that there was a war and a genocide in the 1990s because of people like Mr. Dodik acting like he is now. He has a predecessor serving life in prison for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Many Bosnians who suffered from that terrible ethnic violence came to Iowa for protection and have enriched our state and nation. Many of these Iowans have friends and family still in Bosnia. I spoke to some of them last Friday about an escalating crisis with frightening echoes of the great violence of the 1990s. Mr. Dodik was sentenced by a Bosnian court for unconstitutional actions that reject the authority of Bosnian state institutions. So, rather than stop, he chose to double down. The Bosnian laws prohibiting the functioning of Bosnian state-level security and judicial institutions in that area. Provincial institutions there have been ordered to use force to stop and prevent the lawful actions and operations of a Bosnian state. Bosnians who are loyal to their country or who these ethnic separatists do not consider Serbs, those people are at risk, including family members of my fellow Iowans. This concerns me greatly. Now, the United States, through Secretary Rubio, is taking some action, making it clear that it is also of great concern to the Trump administration. Western Balkan stability has been a U.S. priority across administrations: Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump 1, Biden, and now Trump again. I'm following this situation very closely. America is also watching who in the region is supporting stability and who is backing the return to ethnic separatism and the possible genocide that could once again happen. Remember, it didn't end well for those same people in the 1990s. I will work with the Trump administration to make sure that we keep up the pressure on Mr. Dodik and his allies to stop and respect the Dayton Peace Accords that ended this violence in 1995. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week the Washington Examiner published an article highlighting Democrats' third filibuster of this new Congress. That's right. You heard it. Third. The party that mere months ago, literally, was gleefully making plans to destroy the filibuster is now using the filibuster left and right. But as we know, for Democrats, it's one rule for me, another for thee. And as the Washington Examiner piece made clear, some Democrats are even embracing their hypocrisy. You use the rules that exist, one Democrat said. I might advocate for a higher speed limit, but I still observe the speed limit until it's changed. Well, okay, Mr. President, but are Democrats still crusading to abolish the filibuster while Republicans are in charge? The answer is, of course not. Because abolishing the filibuster isn't about principle for Democrats. It's about political advantage. So Democrats will unashamedly support different rules depending on who's in charge. Now, Mr. President, I could spend my whole time today talking about Democrats' rank hypocrisy when it comes to the filibuster. But I also like to talk about the content of the bills that they filibustered and what that says about the Democrat Party. Mr. President, in a few short weeks of this new Congress, Democrats have filibustered 3 bills. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, otherwise known as the ICC Sanctions Bill, and the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act was a simple bill. It simply stated that a baby born alive after an attempted abortion must be given the same protection and medical care that any other newborn baby would be given. That's it. You would assume such a bill would be entirely uncontroversial. Democrats may not believe in protecting unborn human beings, but surely they still believe in protecting born human beings. But as it turns out, protecting born human beings, at least when they're born alive after an abortion, is not on the Democrats' priority list. In fact, every Democrat in the Senate, every Democrat, without exception, voted against this bill. And I'm afraid the sad truth, Mr. President, is that Democrats are so deeply concerned with preserving the supposed right to kill unborn babies, they couldn't bring themselves to protect born babies, for fear that it would eventually lead to recognizing the humanity of the unborn. And all I can say, Mr. President, is that a party that is so committed to killing unborn babies that it can't vote to protect born babies is nothing short of morally bankrupt. So that was the first bill that Democrats filibustered. The next was the ICC Sanctions Bill, and that was another straightforward bill, Mr. President. It would have sanctioned foreign individuals who are involved in international criminal court efforts to investigate, arrest, or prosecute U.S. citizens or citizens of U.S. allies that are not party to the ICC, or the International Criminal Court. The bill was a response to the ICC's decision to pursue warrants for Israeli officials. And it was also designed to protect Americans, and American soldiers in particular, who've been targeted by the ICC in the past. But once again, Senate Democrats, with one lone exception, found themselves incapable of taking a stand. Now, I'm not sure if it was anti-Israel animus, or if they were afraid of antagonizing the anti-Israel wing of their party, or if they're simply too beholden to big tech, which lodged some tenuous concerns about this legislation. But for whatever reason, Democrats filibustered the bill. And in doing so, they not only failed to rebuke the ICC for its illegitimate targeting of Israeli leaders, but they failed to protect U.S. citizens. Mr. President, the third bill the Democrats filibustered, and filibustered just this past week, I might add, was the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. This legislation was designed to restore the original intent of Title IX, which is giving women equal opportunities in education by ensuring that women and girls only are permitted to play in women's sports at federally funded educational institutions. The bill, of course, is a response to the growing problem of women's sports being invaded by biological males. And I want to quote for you something from an August 2024, this is United Nations report. Just last August, report from the United Nations on violence against women and girls, and it noted, and I quote, "The replacement of the female sports category with a mixed-sex category has resulted in an increasing number of female athletes losing opportunities, including medals, when competing against males. According to information received by March 30th of 2024, over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports," end quote. Over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports. That a quote, Mr. President, out of the United Nations report on violence against women and girls coming in August of last year. Mr. President, it's not even remotely fair. Girls should not be having to compete in races that are stacked against them. Women deserve their own athletic opportunities, opportunities that are not taken away from them by biological males who have their own spaces in which to compete. But try explaining that to Democrats. Democrats like to portray themselves as leading the charge on women's issues. But not one Democrat, not one, could bring himself or herself to vote in support of women and girls. Biological males, not women, got Democrat support last Monday. Well, apparently, Democrats' commitment to equal opportunity for women only runs so deep and quickly falls by the wayside when the left demands adherence to some new ideology. Mr. President, the outcome of the 2024 presidential election was partially rebuke of far-left dogmas and ideologies. But apparently, Democrats have learned nothing from that electoral rebuke. Today, Mr. President, the supposed party of the little guy, the underdog, the disadvantaged, has become a party willing to sacrifice born human beings to abortion extremism and equality for women and girls on the altar of transgender ideology. I have to say, Mr. President, it is no wonder that the American people rejected them in November of 2024. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Ms. Salsa Brooks.
President?
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, last week I came to the floor to debunk some of our Democratic colleagues' myths, disinformation, mistaken information about the work of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. You know, Ronald Reagan liked to say facts are stubborn things. And it's important to talk about the facts because hopefully, even in Washington, D.C., we can agree on the basic facts. We may have some different interpretation, different policy preferences, but facts are facts are facts. Well, today I want to do the same thing about Republican efforts to extend the upcoming expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or what is sometimes called the Trump tax cuts, through the budget reconciliation process. Now, I don't blame the American people or anybody else from listening to all of the process we talk about and just their eyes glazing over and just tuning us out. But the truth is this, because if we don't extend the expiring provisions of this tax bill that we passed back in 2017 during President Trump's first term, a vast majority of the American people will experience a tax increase. And that, of course, is on top of 40-year high inflation during the Biden administration. So, you know, I guess nobody likes to talk about taxes because on one hand, people say, well, that's, you know, people need to keep more of their hard-earned money. On the left, what they like to say is you're giving billionaires a tax cut and leaving average wage earners and working families high and dry. And the truth is, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act bill that we passed in 2017, the individual rates that will expire at the end of this year, if we don't continue the current policy using the budget reconciliation process, 62% of American taxpayers will experience a tax increase. That's not just millionaires and billionaires, that's everybody across the income spectrum. Well, on the left, our Democratic colleagues, some of them have been claiming that extending these tax cut provisions, as I said, will benefit the very rich at the expense of the rest of us. Our colleague from Massachusetts, Senator Markey, said, quote, instead of fighting for working people, Trump is selling them out to give billionaires tax breaks. There they go again. And to no surprise, our colleague from Vermont, Senator Sanders, accused President Trump and Elon Musk of being oligarchs. Oligarchs. He went on to say, and I quote, the oligarchs, that's the very rich people who've accumulated massive wealth primarily in Russia and in Europe. But he said the oligarchs with their tremendous resources are waging a war on working class of this country. The needs, the concerns, the ideas, the dreams of ordinary people are simply an impediment to what they, the oligarchs, are entitled to. Well, this accusation, if true, would be serious. But it's not true. Representative Neal from Massachusetts on the other side of the Capitol went so far as to describe the Trump tax cuts as reverse Robin Hood scam. And the list goes on and on and on and on. It's almost as if there is a concerted or orchestrated effort to use disinformation and propaganda to try to prejudice the American people against what it is we need to do in order to avoid this huge tax increase on the vast majority of Americans. But let's set aside for a moment the fact that President Trump won this last election, promising to do what? Well, to extend the tax cuts that passed in 2017. We know before COVID hit, our economy was hitting on all cylinders. All cohorts of the population, African Americans, Hispanics, everyday working Americans were experiencing record high levels of employment, and the economy was the best it's been in my lifetime. Well, we know what happened these last 4 years. We know that Biden economics, or Bidenomics as they like to call it, I don't know why in the world President Biden embraced the name Biden economics, because it was associated with just so much misery and pain and a reduced standard of living by average working class families across the country. But we know that inflation, again, the 40-year high inflation that we have experienced in the last few years, has a disproportionate effect on low-income families. Now, that's no surprise, because your purchasing power, if you're on a fixed income or if you're just getting by paycheck to paycheck, the more inflation goes up, the more everything you buy costs. And households across the spectrum are affected. We've seen that with our own eyes, and in fact, I believe that was one of the reasons President Trump was reelected in 2024. Well, when you spend a higher percentage of your paycheck on necessities, you have less of a cushion as prices increase. It's just common sense. Now, to add insult to injury, Democratic colleagues do when they were in the majority in response to this massive inflation, which was the direct result of their policies, well, they poured gasoline on the fire of inflation by using reconciliation to pass something called the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, hold that thought for a minute, because the Inflation Reduction Act, even at the time it passed, was evaluated and calculated not to reduce inflation. So again, this is deception, really, at the outset, claiming that this Inflation Reduction Act maybe would have a negative impact on inflation. But President Biden himself later admitted it, quote, has less to do with reducing inflation, close quote. That's what President Biden said, and was full of even more spending. Well, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, would say the main cause of inflation is too much spending. You flood the economy with more dollars, and naturally, the price of everything tends to go up. And you don't need a PhD economist like Dr. Larry Summers, who was probably the most prominent Democratic economist in our country, to tell anyone, and especially not the President of the United States, that the answer to runaway inflation is not more government spending. But that's exactly what the Inflation Reduction Act did. But that's not all. Not only did the Inflation Reduction Act do nothing for inflation, it actually did what Democrats have wrongly accused Republicans of doing. It benefited high earners at the expense of ordinary Americans. You don't have to take my word for it, just look at the data, look at the facts. By some estimates, the Inflation Reduction Act's electric vehicle and charging infrastructure provisions are projected to cost $180 billion over the next decade. The average cost of an electric vehicle is nearly $7,000 more than an internal combustion engine in 2023. So most working class families, rather than pay $7,000 more for an electric vehicle, assuming they wanted an electric vehicle, have opted for the lower price internal combustion engine. And so the ones that were taking advantage of the subsidy of $7,500 if you bought an EV were wealthy people by definition. So our Democratic colleagues, contrary to their propaganda and misinformation, have been the ones that have providing your hard-earned dollars to subsidize wealthy people to buy luxury items like an electric vehicle. Households that earn more than $200,000 reportedly represent 42.6% of electric vehicle sales. So people who make more than $200,000 a year, that's 42.6% of electric vehicle sales. while those earning between $100,000 and $200,000 represented 32.9%. So, if anything deserves to be called reverse Robin Hood, it would be Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act. Given the inflationary and regressive policies that the Democrats promoted during the last 4 years, it's ironic, and maybe even you would say laughable, to hear them accuse Republicans of being disconnected from everyday Americans. The reason why Republicans won the majority in both houses and President Trump was reelected is because he connected with the concerns of everyday Americans, and particularly their concerns about the overspending and inflation, not to mention the border. So our Democratic colleagues really don't have legs to stand on when it comes to the facts. Failing to extend the Trump tax cuts would mean, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, that 62% of Americans would see it 2026. On the other hand, extending the tax cuts would result in a 3.4% increase in after-tax income in 2026 by some estimates. In the 2 years after President Trump signed his tax cuts into law, median household income grew by $5,000. That's more money to spend on the necessities of life. And in the same period, real wages grew by nearly 5%. Again, Madam President, those are the facts. You would think that the facts would be something we could agree on, and then we can talk about policies. But unfortunately, our Democratic colleagues seem to gloss right over those facts while making wild accusations, which frankly are way off the mark. Contrast this with President Biden's policy, slapping working families with an effective pay cut. With higher prices for food, gasoline, and other necessities, inflation-adjusted disposable income per capita during the Biden presidency went down 7.7%. No wonder people felt squeezed, particularly if you were relatively modest income or you were senior on a fixed income. Your purchasing power went down 7.7%. The stark reality and the fact is, if Congress fails to extend the Trump tax cuts that expire at the end of this year, the average family of four making $75,000 a year will face a $1,500 tax increase next year. Working families will see the child tax credit cut in half. So the facts are pretty obvious, as plain as the nose on your face. Extending the Trump tax cuts will actually benefit working families, and doing nothing, which is what our Democratic colleagues seem to want, will make them worse off. In the end of the day, we work for the people we represent in our respective states, and certainly the voters in Alabama and Texas and in the majority of the country have made their preference clear. President Trump campaigned on extending these tax cuts. Republicans in the House and the Senate did the same, and we were rewarded with majorities in both houses and President Trump with being reelected to the White House. Working families in Texas and across the country voted for the president and the political party who they thought would benefit them the most, especially their pocketbooks and their standard of living. And they voted resoundingly for President Trump and congressional Republicans. So it's simply not true to say that Republicans are somehow out of touch with the voters that gave us the majority in both houses and President Trump reelected to the White House. I know our Democratic colleagues are angry. They don't like being in the minority. It's not a lot of fun, but there's a reason, and they still haven't learned that the policies they promoted and that they sold to the American people were rejected on November the 5th. So sometimes as Ronald Reagan liked to say, again, facts are stubborn things. So I would invite our colleagues across the aisle to look at the facts and maybe look in the mirror and say, what we were doing didn't work out so well, so maybe we ought to work with Republicans to change our policies. The American people simply cannot afford a tax increase on top of 40-year high inflation. I look forward to Republican colleagues in the House and the Senate to deliver by extending the Trump tax cuts and to make life better for working families in Texas and across the country. And I would invite our Democratic colleagues to join us if they will. I'm not sure they're there yet. They're still pretty angry. They're still pretty upset. They're still, what do they call it? They call it the resistance. They are the party of the resistance. Well, right now they're resisting what's best for the American people, and that's a bad place to be. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.